this time linguistically oriented, if I can say so, and also touching topics which I think are of great interest for many or most of us here. I just would like to welcome Hana Hledíková, and she will present the result of her research on valency of prefix and particle bound verbs in 3 languages. If I'm not mistaken. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So this talk in a nutshell is going to be about using SynSemClass, which is a kind of verb lexicon developed here at ÚFAL, to investigate the valency of verbs containing a prefix or a particle in 3 languages in which these kinds of verbs are frequent, namely Czech, English, and German, languages that are included in this resource. So the goal of the research that I'm going to present is a cross-linguistic comparison of this phenomenon using the available data. So I will first introduce the topic, and I will show why prefix and particle verbs are interesting in terms of valency and what kind of specific questions they raise. And then what are the difficulties in trying to address these questions in a data-based way and cross-linguistically. Then I will talk about the experiment. So I will introduce the data and method, first the compilation of the data sample using these data resources, and then the analysis, and then describe the results and discuss them, as well as the method more generally and its limitations. So the talk is going to be about verbs like these, in these examples. So verbs that contain a prefix or a particle and are formed from another verb. For example, in Czech, these are verbs like vy-hodit, to throw out, formed from the verb hodit, to throw. In German, they work in a similar way. However, some of these prefixes are separable, which means that in certain syntactic contexts, they get separated from the verb and they are used as a separate word, as we can see on this example sentence here. And this is why these separable prefixes have sometimes been referred to as verb-particles, because in this characteristics, they resemble English particle verbs like throw out. In a sentence, she threw something out, that is parallel to sie warf etwas aus. Because of these similarities between the prefixes and particles, they have sometimes been called by a cover term preverbs that refers to both of these in previous literature. And the function of these prefixes or particles is first of all a word formation function, so they create a new verb from a base verb, and then a semantic function, because the prefix adds some kind of meaning to the meaning of the base verb. And so we would like to say that at least on some level, the new verb's meaning is a combination of the base verb's meaning and the particle or prefix's meaning. The issue with the semantic effect is that the prefixes and particles tend to be very polyfunctional, meaning that one form is associated with multiple different meanings, and some of these meanings can be quite abstract. So here on this line, we can see an example of 4 Czech verbs formed using the same prefix, při, and the meaning that we would ascribe to the prefix ranges from a very concrete one in přijet, this has some kind of spatial directional meaning towards, to a very abstract one in přichystat, where we could say that it mostly adds some modification to the aspectual or actionsart characteristics of the verb. And in these very abstract meanings, we can even have pairs of verbs that are created from the same base verb, but using a different prefix that are very similar in their meaning, like přichystat and nachystat, where it would be quite difficult to describe what exactly is the meaning difference between the two. And there have been different approaches to the semantic side of the prefixes. But what we will be interested in today in this talk is another effect that the addition of the prefix or particle can have, which we could call syntactic or syntactic semantic effect. That is, it can lead to changes in the base verb's valency. And I will introduce this topic in the following slides. I will start with simply explaining what the term valency is. So put simply, it is the number and type of syntactic elements that a verb requires. To demonstrate this on an example, the verb to sleep denotes an action in which there is one participant, the one who is sleeping, and therefore it requires one syntactic element that, when it is used in a sentence, like Petra is sleeping. In contrast, the verb to drink denotes an action where we not only have the one who is drinking, but also something that is being drunk. And so it requires syntactic elements for those two participants, as in the sentence, Petra is drinking lemonade. And these are required to be expressed unless they can be left out due to reasons of, let's say, context. I want to stress right at the beginning that the valency is not a characteristic of the verb as a whole, as a lexeme, but rather of the verb in its individual senses. So if we have the verb to sleep in a different sense, to have sex with, then that action typically requires two at least participants. And therefore, in the sentence like Petra is sleeping with Pavel, now we have two syntactic elements required by the verb, in contrast to spát, to sleep, in the first sense. And conversely, if we take the meaning to drink alcohol, to be an alcoholic, as a separate sense of the verb pít, to drink, then that verb only requires one participant, as in Petra pije, Petra drinks, Petra is an alcoholic. And in connection with prefixes and particles, it has been observed in previous literature that the addition of the prefix and particle, aside from changing the verb's meaning, can also lead to changes in the verb's valency. And there have been some similarities in the changes that have been noticed in Germanic and Slavic languages. I will demonstrate this on an example. So here we have the verb to sleep in Czech, German, and English. That has only one participant. And when we form the prefix or particle verb meaning to sleep away or sleep something through, then now the verb requires a syntactic element expressing the amount of time that has been slept through. So Petr prospal celé odpoledne, Petr slept through the whole afternoon, or Petr slept the whole afternoon away. So this effect of the addition of some kind of additional valency slot has been observed across different forms of prefixes. And the possible analysis of this effect is that on a general level, the prefix or particle adds some kind of resultative meaning. In one type of analysis, we could even say that the particle or prefix verb describes two events on the conceptual level. One event that causes the other, and that is the result. For example, the sentence, Peter slept the whole afternoon away. We have the action where Peter does something, he sleeps, and then that causes the afternoon to be depleted or non-existent. And so, because we have a resulting state, it makes sense that we need an affected entity that is in that kind of resultative state. And that entity will often be expressed in the direct object position in a basic sentence with the verb in the active voice. So in other words, these structures may predicate over a direct object, regardless of whether it happens to be the one selected by the verb where no result predicate is present, or put in another way, even though the base word doesn't require that argument and is intransitive. So it often leads to transitivization. And this transitivization effect can also manifest itself in different ways. For example, the element that with the base unprefixed verb is expressed using a prepositional phrase can go on to be expressed in the direct object position in the prefix or particle verb. For example, the verb to wait goes with the prepositional phrase for, as in Peter waited for the rain. But when we form the prefixed or particle verb wait out, then we wait out not for the rain, but we wait out the rain. Also, in some cases, the participant is possible to be left out and the sentence still be grammatical, such as we can say Petr pracoval, Peter worked, without saying on what. But when we form the prefix verb vypracovat, to work something out, then we have to say Petr vypracoval návrh, Petr vypracoval něco. We can't just say Petr vypracoval. Also, the resultative nature of the prefix can add something else than the direct object position. For example, when we form the verb cut out from the base word cut, then the sort of directional meaning of out requires us to say out of what. Peter cut out pictures from where? From the magazine. So in this case, it is an addition to a transitive verb of some different valency slot that basically describes the direction from where. And so these examples may lead us to hypothesize that prefixes and particles have on some level common tendencies in the types of valency changes that they cause. And the result of this would lead us to predict that there will be mostly additions of valency slots for the entity in the resulting states, and possibly also additions of the valency slot expressing directions. Also, we have seen that there have been some previously observed analogical examples in Slavic and Germanic, and so we may want to ask, are there analogical patterns in the valency changes cross-linguistically? The issue is that these questions have mostly been investigated in the previous literature using a number of selected examples. And what we would like to do is to address these questions based on a larger data sample. If we want to use data, one possible data source would be valency lexicons. So lexicons, which for each verb lemma list some kind of valency characteristics for each of their senses, like Valex, which is developed for Czech here at ÚFAL, or PropBank, a similar type of resource for a number of other languages, and a number of other types of valency lexicons for other languages. However, there are certain difficulties that are connected with using valency lexicons to answer the questions that I introduced in the beginning. First of all, valency lexicons do not contain mapping between the senses of derivationally related verbs. So if we want to describe the difference in valency that happens when we form the verb prohrát from the base verb hrát, we can use the valency lexicon entries in Valex for the two verbs because they are both covered by Valex. However, Valex itself doesn't tell us that these two verbs are related. And it's not always just a question of saying that this is a substring of this. So we firstly need to know that these two verbs are derivationally related, pair of prefix and base verb. And what's more, we want to know which concrete senses of these two verbs are related. Because for to play, Valex lists more than 5 different senses: to play in a game, to play a role as an actor, to perform music, to pretend, and some idiomatic senses. And only one of these, the first one, is connected to the meaning lose, to be defeated, of prohrát. And if we want to describe this valency change that happens, we don't want to compare all of the valency frames to all of those valency frames, but only those that are really connected for the senses connected in derivation. Second of all, if we want to approach the question cross-linguistically, the problem is that valency lexicons for individual languages are not directly comparable. So when we describe the verb's potential to require certain things in a sentence, we can focus more on the form of the elements, for example, describe their case or preposition that they're used with, or we can focus more on the function or meaning of the elements and on differing levels of abstraction. Also, because the verb appears with a lot of things when it's used in a sentence, there are different ways of telling which of these elements in the sentence are actually required by that specific verb and which are not. So for Czech and English, we have the Valex type lexicon developed here at ÚFAL, which is based on the functional generative description, which focuses on the function of the syntactic elements that the verb requires and assigns functor labels to them. It distinguishes between actants or arguments. These are those that are specific to the given verb and can only be used once with it. These are slots for actor. So if a verb has one slot, it will be the actor. If it has two valency slots, it will be the actor and patient. And if it has three, it will have the actor, patient, and then based on the meaning, either addressee, effect, or origin. And then there are free modifications, which are more adverbial in their meaning. They are things like location, direction 1, 2, 3, so direction from, through, and towards, manner, and so on. And all of these can be either obligatory or optional based on some kind of test. Prop bank is a different type of lexicon that we have mentioned. And here the number of arguments is simply just listed. So to put it without going into details, a verb that has 3 argument slots will have just the description of argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, or argument 0, argument 1, argument 2. Valbo is another type of valency lexicon available for German. And this is an example of a resource that focuses more on the formal characteristics of the complements. So it will tell you that the complement is expressed in the accusative or with some kind of preposition. And the obligatoriness is also somehow distinguished using a test. And there are many more lexicons like this. But what I want to demonstrate is that we can't just simply take them and compare them to each other, because this is an example of the verb to talk in the 3 languages that I talk about. In the sense, someone is talking about something to somebody. And this is the description for it in Valex for the Czech verb. So we have some kinds of functor labels, the information about whether they're obligatory or optional. There's also some kind of formal characteristics that I don't mention here. For the prop bank verb in English, we just have 3 numbered arguments. And for the entry for the German verb in Valbo, we have the 3 complements. One of them will be in the subject position in a basic sentence in the active voice. And then 2 of them will be expressed using a prepositional phrase. And some of them are obligatory and some of them are not. So we can't simply take them and compare them to each other. So I want to approach these difficulties and try to solve them using a combination of word formation data and the SynSemClass lexicon, which I will talk about in the following slides. The word formation data allow me to identify verbs created by prefixation and their base words. And then, using SynSemClass, we can identify the valency frames that are related for the verb's individual senses, and also somehow try to overcome the differences between the valency description in the lexicons for the individual languages. Once we have that, we can analyze the types of valency changes that happen in prefixation and compare them cross-linguistically for the 3 languages that are included in SynSemClass: Czech, German, and English. Okay, so now that I described the general issues and goals, I will talk about the data and method. So first of all, if we want to compare the verbs across languages, we need a comparable verb list. So for the 3 languages, I extracted a list of the verb lemmas from 4 corpora that are comparable in terms of their size. They're of roughly 100 million tokens, as well as the genre distribution. So they all contain some sort of fiction texts, non-fiction texts, and newspaper texts. And I extracted a list of verb lemmas from them. It was about 19,000 verb lemmas for Czech, 10,000 for English, and 25,000 for German. And then I annotated these verbs for their morphemic structure, so the types of morphemes that they contain, and family membership, so what kind of verb they, root lexeme they contain. And I used the available word formation resources combined with manual post-checking. And from this, I was able to extract pairs of lemmas of prefixed and base verbs. For Czech, I ended up with over 8,000 such pairs. For German, it was over 9,000. For English, the phrasal verbs were identified later because they're easy to identify in SynSemClass. So for the valency characteristics now, I use the SynSemClass, which basically is a synonymy lexicon of verbs that contains multiple languages. Right now, it contains Czech, German, English, and Spanish. And what it does, it groups verbs in individual senses into classes based on the notion of semantic equivalence, so synonymy or near synonymy of meaning. So the classes are identified as certain general types of situations based on the participant or semantic roles that take part in them and their relationship. So for example, the verb hrát, to play, in one of its senses, will be put into class with this kind of ID, so class 611, and that class is defined as a performer plays a role, with two roles, the performer and the role. This description is based on FrameNet, which is another type of verb lexicon. And then other verbs in that class will be Czech verbs with a similar meaning, like účinkovat, vystupovat, zahrát, znázorňovat, and so on. And then other verbs in the other three languages of the same or similar meaning. Importantly, SynSemClass is linked to valency lexicons. So for each verb in an individual sense, so for example, hrát in the sense of class 611, that verb in that sense will be linked to a particular dictionary entry in PDT Valex. And so we can retrieve the information that in that sense, the verb has the valency frame actor patient, and similarly to the other languages. So the lexicons that are linked are many, but for Czech, it is primarily PDT Valex, and for English, the English Valex. And for German, it is mainly Propbank and Valbu. And here we run to the first difficulty that the valency lexicons are not directly comparable. So thanks to English Valex, we have a directly comparable representation for Czech and English with the PDT functors. However, for German, we don't. So to demonstrate this, here are two verbs, one meaning to speak, as in the sense a speaker discusses some information with an addressee, and another meaning to appoint. An authority appoints a chosen entity to a function. For Czech and English, the first verb has the actor, patient, and addressee. Someone talks about something to someone. But for appoint, we have actor, patient, and effect. Someone appoints someone to some kind of function. And so we can see that there is a difference in the valency frames of these two verbs in Czech and English because it distinguishes the third valency slot based on function. However, for German, from Valbu, we only have 3 numbered arguments available. And so the issue is, for cross-linguistic comparison, that the level of abstraction is different. These two verbs are different in their valency frame in Czech and English, but same in German. However, because of SynSemClass, we know that these two German verbs in this sense are in the same SynSemClass as speak and mluvit and appoint and jmenovat in Czech and English. And so we can sort of make the conjecture that these 3 valency slots are going to be actor, patient, addressee for sprechen and actor, patient, effective for einsetzen. So we can identify the corresponding functors for the German verbs based on the other Czech and English verbs in the same SynSemClass. And in this way address the issue of cross-linguistic comparison of the lexicons. Then the other issue that we have introduced is that valency lexicons do not contain the mapping between the senses of derivational related verbs. And although now we know that, for example, hrát and zahrát are prefix verb and base verb, because of the word formation data, we don't know which exact senses are related. And here again, SynSemClass can help to a certain extent. So sometimes the semantic addition of the prefix is quite small. And so a lot of the times it happens that the prefix verbs prefix verbs are in some of the exact same classes as the unprefixed verb. For example, zahrát is in class play a role and play music, just like 2 of the 4 SynSemClasses recorded for to play. And so we can map these 2 senses and their corresponding valency frames automatically. In some cases, this is not true. None of the classes map exactly, such as in hrát and prohrát, to lose. So to lose is in a different class, meaning to lose in a game or competition. However, because we have the semantic roles listed for the classes, we can see that for the role set defined for play in a game or competition, there is overlap in some of the roles, namely competition for this class and that class. And that can sort of lead us to maybe these senses being related as well. So we can use the role definition to sort of pre-map possibly related senses of the verbs as well. So now that we have that, we can compile the data sample. First, we have already identified the lemma pairs of prefix verbs and base verbs for Czech and German. Out of the 8,000, about 1,000 of them are pairs such as both the prefix and base verb is recorded in SynSemClass. For German, it is way less, it's about 300. This is not because the prefix verbs would be less frequent in German, but because the coverage of SynSemClass is smaller for German. And then for English, we just identified corresponding particle verbs. There are over 300 of them in SynSemClass because they are listed there in a specific format. It's the verb underscore particle. So for example, take underscore off. So now we have to tell which SynSemClasses of the base and prefix verb are related to be able to map the valency frames for related senses. So we can first use SynSemClass to do some pre-mapping where the same classes are automatically mapped onto each other, as in hrát and zahrát. And where that's not the case, we go through them manually and annotate them. And we use the overlap in semantic roles as some kind of guide that makes it easier. So the final sample includes 800 or over 800 sense pairs mapped for Czech, over 200 for German, and over 250 for English. Now that we have these sense pairs, we can simply look at the change in valency for each of the items. So spát and prospát, in their particular senses defined by their class, have the valency frames actor for sleep and actor patient for sleep through. And so we can say that the addition of the prefix is accompanied by the addition of the patient slot. In a different pair, platit and podplatit, to pay and to bribe, in a certain sense defined by the SynSemClasses. Platit, to pay, has the actor, patient, and addressee. Someone pays something to somebody. And the podplatit verb to bribe only has an actor and patient. Někdo podplatí někoho. And so we can say that the addition of the prefix is accompanied by the deletion of the addressee slot. So now I will show the results. I will show the number of items, so the sentence pairs, that were recorded with each of individual valency change and in each individual prefix in each of the 3 languages. And I will show the languages separately. So this is the table for Czech. It is difficult to read, so I will go through it so that you can know how to read it. Each of the rows is individual prefixes, and each of the columns are individual types of valency changes. So for example, this column records changes where the patient slot is added. The second column is the change where the patient and origin slot are added, and so on. And each of the cells then shows you the number of items with that given prefix and that given change in valency slot. The row here gives you the sum of all the changes of that type, no matter the prefix. And because there are many different individual changes in the valency slot, I group them together based on the hierarchy of the arguments. First of all, the first column shows you the number of items where there is no change in valency. Then this green part shows you where those changes where there is a change in the first or second, because there aren't changes in the actor, second valency slot, patient. So either it is added or deleted. Then if there's no change in the patient, here we go on to the blue part, which records changes in the third valency slot, addressee, origin, or effect. So either one of these is added or it is deleted. And then if there's no change in that, we go on to directional changes. They were hypothesized to be frequent in previous literature, and indeed they are in our data. So they constitute a separate category. And then there is a category for the rest of the changes that don't fall into these categories. And the colors help you because the more red something is, the more something is added, and yellows are deletions. So for example, here we can see all of the changes in patient are actually cases where the patient argument is added. And so what we can see first of all is that most frequently there is no change in valency recorded. These are the majority of cases. When there is a change in patient, we can see that most of them are additions, which is expected. There are just minority cases of deletions, and these are sort of strange, weird cases. Then when we go on to the change in addressee, origin, or effect, we can see that actually the most frequent changes are deletions, followed by some additions that are also well attested. So here we have both additions and deletions. And for the directional changes, most of them are additions. The most frequent addition is in the plus direction 3, meaning the addition of a valency slot that expresses the direction towards something. For English, the table works in a similar way. And again, the majority of cases records no change in valency. When there is a change in patient, again, we can see that most frequent changes are additions, but there are also some deletions, and here they are also sort of non-minority category. Then the change in the third valency slot again shows us that the most frequent changes are actually deletions, and then there are also additions, so this is also similar to Czech. And then in the changes in direction, we actually see a contrast, because in Czech, we were mostly adding directional valency slots, but for English, we are mostly deleting them. And again, the most frequent change is the change in the third direction, but this time it is deletion. Then for German, the table really looks kind of sad now, because the sample is small already, and then the majority of cases are again cases where there is no change in valency. But we can see that changes in patient are also additions, which is in accordance with the previous languages. And then for the addressee, origin, or effect, we again see both deletions and additions. And for the changes in direction, there are basically not any attested. And I will come back to why that might be later. So I know the tables are hard to read like this, so I will just sum up the most sort of important overall characteristics for the languages. So we have seen that in all the languages, there's mostly no change in valency between the base and prefix verbs. And out of those, also, they are mostly items for which we have the same class for the prefix and base verb. It is 48% of the pairs in Czech, 39% in English, and 67% for German. So these are going to be the cases that we talked about right at the beginning, cases where the prefix mostly leads to changes in aspects or actions art, like psát and napsat, to write imperfective and to write perfective, or cases like hrát, dohrát, to play, to finish playing, where the prefix adds some kind of phrasal information. They might be accompanied by changes in form, as we also have talked about previously. Like, for example, we rule somebody in genitive, but we ovládnout prefixed verb to rule somebody in accusative. I don't know so far how many of them are there, because we only looked at the function and not the form yet. Then we have seen that for the patient slot, there were mostly additions across the languages, which is something that has been expected based on the literature. There are going to be cases like zářit and ozářit něco, to shine and to shine onto something. In German, to dauern and etwas überdauern, last and outlast something. For English, cases like live and live off something, like live off the land, and so on. But we have also seen some cases in English that are not just strange cases, but seem to be legit cases of deletions of the patient, such as to show something possibly to someone versus to show off possibly to someone, like show your skill to the audience and to show off to the audience. Then for the third valency slot, we have seen deletions as well as additions. This is something that has not been focused in the previous literature that mostly talks about the effect of adding a valency slot. But in Czech and English, we have seen that deletions are actually more frequent than additions. They can be deletions, for example, of the addressee slot, like in prodat někomu něco versus rozprodat něco, to sell something to somebody and to sell out something. Then also cases, for example, where the affective is deleted, like soudit něco o něčem versus odsoudit něco, to judge something as something and to condemn something. But also additions were found, for example, in addressee, such as in cases like psát něco and předepsat něco někomu, to write something and to prescribe something to somebody. The largest difference across the languages was found in the changes in the directional slots. So in Czech, we have mostly seen additions, like in cases of psát něco versus vepsat něco někam, to write something and to in-write something into something. But in English, they are mostly deletions, and these are cases like to come somewhere, to come home, versus to come around, which doesn't need another participant slot. And in German, we have seen neither, because these changes were not attested, and this is likely due to the lower coverage of a SynSemClass for German, which leads me to the discussion of the limitations of the method. So first of all, I need to say that sometimes it is difficult to map the related classes for each of the items. This has multiple reasons, but one of them is, for example, the different degrees of generalization in the definition of the classes in SynSemClass. To have a simple example, here we have the verb hodnotit and a prefix verb formed from that verb nadhodnotit, meaning value and overvalue. For hodnotit to value, we have two different classes distinguishing whether that sense is the monetary sense, having to do with money, and another class for other senses. Versus for nadhodnotit to overvalue, we have just one more general class, meaning both monetary and other senses. In this case, it is simple. We simply map both of the more detailed classes to the more general one for the prefix verb. But there are cases in which that generalization sort of doesn't overlap in a nice way like this. And so sometimes it's difficult to decide how exactly they should be mapped. Also, and this is probably the most serious issue so far, the coverage of SynSemClass differs for the languages that are included in it. There are about 300 classes covered for German versus over 1,000 classes for Czech and English. And that's why the sample for German was kind of sad. The genre influences the coverage of the classes as well, the genre of the texts that were used to build SynSemClass. So because at least part of SynSemClass was built using Wall Street Journal, the sort of classes having to do with finance vocabulary are very well covered. But because the texts were mostly written, or probably only written, when the annotators were annotating the verbs for SynSemClass, verbs of physical movement like to go or walk or come or carry are often not as well covered as some of their other senses that are more abstract or idiomatic. And so the physical senses are missing, especially for the German SynSemClass. And this has to do, at least partly, with the directional changes that were not very attested in German, because the directional changes are typical of verbs of movement. And English and Czech are quite well covered now, but for German, a lot of these senses that we would probably consider in some way primary are missing in SynSemClass. The analysis so far also doesn't capture changes in form. So as we talked about, we are on the level of function and not the level of changes in prefixes or case information. And also, it doesn't capture changes in a more fine-grained semantic role. So to demonstrate this on an example, we have two verbs, to drink and to outdrink someone, pít and přepít. In the sentence like Petra drank beer and Petra outdrank Pavel, on the level of PDT functors, we have an actor and a patient for both verbs, and so there is no change in valency. However, conceptually, beer, the patient role here, is something else than Pavel with outdrank. Here it is really the drink, the liquid that Petra drank, but Pavel is not what Petra drank, it's someone that she drank against. So again, this is not captured because the functors don't distinguish these kinds of roles. Finally, there are some things that have not been addressed in the questions. We have only looked into the changes of prefix versus base verbs or particle verbs versus base verbs in general, but we haven't looked into the specifics of individual forms of prefixes and particles. So in the future, we may want to ask, are there some specific tendencies for specific forms of prefixes? And can we group together prefixes which cause similar valency changes in one language, but also cross-linguistically? But we would need a bigger sample of verbs so that each prefix is assessed more than a few times, especially for German. And so to sum up, in the talk, I have tried to show that SynSemClass is useful for investigating the prefix and particle verbs across languages, because it offers some kind of way to bridge the differences across lexicon for different languages. And also it helps to map the senses together, because it allows us to do some part of the annotation automatically, but also because it kind of offers us a way of representing meaning on some sort of unified level of generalization in most cases. Then the analysis showed that for the three languages under analysis, Czech, English, and German, there are some analogical patterns that the data revealed. Some of them are expected based on the previous literature. So these are the cases where there is no change in valency or the addition of the patient argument, which is expected under the resultative analysis. And there are also analogical patterns that were not discussed in previous literature because it focused mostly on the patient argument. And these are namely the deletions in the third valency slot, so addressee, effect, and origin. But the analysis also showed some differences between the languages. For example, the several cases of deletion of patient in English that were not attested in the other two languages. And also in the directional valency slots, we have seen deletions for English versus additions for Czech. The largest issue right now seems to be the different coverage of the languages in SynSemClass for the cross-linguistic comparison. And so the analysis will need to be redone when the larger sample for German is released in SynSemClass. Okay, and that's all from me. So thank you for the attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And I think as we have many specials here on valency, so I hope to hear several questions on that respect.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. And also I have to say that it's very satisfying to see that someone is using SynSemClass, which actually wasn't planned for such studies, or the goal was different. So thank you very much for that. And to the German language, now I'm not sure what kind of version you used.
5.1.
So there are
Okay, 400. Okay.
And now
1,000.
1,000. So if you like to continue in your study, which would be great, So you will have the opportunity to use the new version, which would be released, we hope, in June.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's the plan. So with the new release, once there is more data, just to rerun the analysis again so that the German sample looks less sad.
Thank you very much. It was really a nice presentation. I am interested in whether you used also pairs of reflexive and non-reflexive verbs, such as starat se, obstarat.
So so far, I didn't include the reflexive verbs in the analysis. It's a next step. So there are definitely cases where not only is there a prefix added, but also the verb can become reflexive or the other way around. These cases are, so I searched them out in SynSemClass, but I haven't mapped their classes onto each other yet. And I want to do that in the future to be able to describe the sort of the effect of both reflexivization and prefixation together. But the answer right now is that they're not included in the sample right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Hanko, very much. I'm actually very fascinated by your using these databases for such a resource. A little bit, it's even kind of nostalgic for me, and I appear to myself to be a very old woman when I want to say that. But when I studied my high school, we did kind of a similar research, having no such databases. And this was really looking at all newspapers, and it was kind of a very difficult task. And so finally, we didn't come to general results. And just to some examples that appeared to be very interesting, but didn't come to kind of typology. And in this respect, I just wanted to say that it could be also interesting to compare these things, just to look for reasons for such similarities. So we were looking for in Czech, German, Serbian, and a little bit around, like in Polish. And it was seen that the valency changes in Polish were different from German, Czech, and Sorbish together. So it was interesting from typological point of view. But it wasn't done on such big data. So I really envied you when I looked at at these numbers. It's really brilliant to have this possibility. And may I have a little question? When you speak about changing about deletion of valency, like patient actor patient addressee, and then deletion of addressee and having plotted and pot-plotted. Do you think a little bit about semantics in this respect? So actually this patient is in some kind could be addressee in fact. So we are kind of relying of our theory, saying that if we have the second valency, it should be patient, not addressee or something like that. So did you consider this somehow?
Right, yeah. That's an interesting question because actually a lot of the cases like this, in this case, really the patient slot here semantically maps on the addressee here, right? It's the person that is paid. But because of the theoretical framework, because once the verb has just two participants, it's actor and patient, it shows up as the deletion of the addressee. So it really is tied to the sort of functional generative description framework, but it would be probably good to look at these cases and actually see maybe just like conceptually which of them of the slots for the prefix verb and the unprefixed verb map onto each other in the type of entity. because a lot of these cases, there are a lot of these cases in the data where we would rather want to say that somehow the patient is deleted, right? So it could be like two levels of description, one more formal like this, and then an additional analysis of the cases. And there would be probably like several groups, some of them where the deleted slot actually maps onto the patient of the base verb. There are also some where really it's the addressee that's deleted. So it would need an additional sort of analysis somewhere between FrameNet and PDT functors. So, but it's not done it, but it's true. And as far as looking at the reasons for the analogies, there would definitely be the question of language contact, for example, between Czech and German as well, as you mentioned previously, and some kinds of other like analyses based more on the conceptual structure of the prefixed and particle verbs that are based on like previous research that I mentioned that could be incorporated into the discussion of the analysis in the future as well.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I think that prefixes may have effect on meaning, and then it's logical to also take meaning changes into account and to annotate or to have the description on more abstract level than functors are. And my question is that I don't understand, or I have an explanation why the directional meaning in English are lost when verbs are prefixed. Do you have any explanation?
So you like okay, so it's going to be cases like these, where really the it is around is first of all an sort of preposition or adverb. And when it forms the particle verb like come around, basically that valency slot that here is expressed by something syntactic is kind of saturated by the adverbial meaning of the particle. So we have to come somewhere, but when someone comes around, or I don't know, when something flies off, for example, we fly somewhere, but when we say fly off, it's kind of implied where, somewhere away. So a lot of the times it's something that has been described for German as well, but we don't have these in German here. But it's sort of described as the prefix or particle saturating the slot that would here be described or supplied by syntax. So it's really analogical cases to this, where it is now considered one lexical unit, come around, but the around kind of saturates some adverbial directional complement of the base. Would be my explanation.
My last remark is that I have tried to annotate the relation between prefixed and non-prefixed verbs in Valex, or precisely between individual senses. And it was a much more difficult task than try to annotate the relation between reflexive and non-reflexive verbs.
Yes, it is difficult, especially if I just went through Valex. It's really like dictionary descriptions. So it is difficult to map. SynSemClass helps a little bit because it offers you some kind of more unified semantic representation. So instead of just dictionary definitions, you have the class definition. And sort of sometimes two Valex senses are mapped into the same SynSemClass. So it kind of like it makes the meaning description more generic and more comparable across lexemes. So that's good, and it helps. And it helps with when the classes are exactly the same. Someone has kind of like done that before for you for some of the individual senses. But if the advantage in looking at this in just Valex would be that the coverage would be higher. So a lot of the things that we would find in Valex will not be included in SynSemClass so far. Like some of the senses probably won't be there. So it's kind of, it makes it easier, but it makes the coverage lower. So I haven't tried it in Valex, but I can imagine that it will be difficult. It is difficult here as well. And I'm trying to have a colleague annotate the Czech part as well to see if we agree on the mapping or not, because a lot of it was done manually. So we'll see how that ends up.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have a question. Well, not really a question, but a remark. If you can show us one of the first slides when you had the statistical data, how many?
Yeah, it's going to be in the table.
Yes, here. So the size is the same for Czech, English, and German. But then when you look at the verb lemmas, then there are big differences. Of course, this depends or is related to the typological differences between the languages, but I just would be curious to know whether in your analysis, in the process of your analysis, you came across some explanation for this difference.
Yes. So first of all, I want to say that for English, for example, things like take off will be under take in this table. So for example, the particle verbs will be under their lemma without the particle. And also really like prefixation is the main cause of this, and composition in German. So in German and in Czech, the prefixes sort of multiply the number of lemmas in a major way. And then for German also composites that have frequent first parts like back, away, or something like that, also multiply the number of lexemes. So these differences actually do make sense. The size of the corpus is the same, but the number of lemmas is different across languages, and really they are due to typological reasons when you look at the data.
Thank you. So if there are no questions, as I can see, let me thank you again for your interesting talk, and we wish you good luck for the further trip, so to say, with the data you already have collected. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Jo. A ono to nakonec potom už nebylo až tak jako pomalý, když se člověk zvykl na to, jak funguje SynSemClass, ale je to teda jako práce ruční. Ono totiž jako většina z nich je opravdu jako, že se namapují automaticky stejný třídy SynSemClassový, takže vlastně nakonec jako ty ruční práce z těch jako třeba skoro 900 českých slov je polovina, takže to je jako dobrý, no ale jinak jsem to dělala ručně.
A proč těch tak málo, těch 300 vlastně jako není vlastně
Jo, ale fakt se to jako tím hodně prostě je to, teda nakonec jsem byla opravena, že jich jako skoro 400 vlastně, jako já jsem tam měla, že přes 300, ale jako i tak vlastně jsou to